If you've used a large language model, you've likely had one or more moments of amazement as the tool immediately responded with impressive content from its massive data cosmos training set. But you've likely also had moments of confusion or disillusionment as the tool responded with irrelevant or incorrect responses, displaying a lack of reasoning. A recent research paper from Meta caught our eye because it proposes a new mechanism called System 2 Attention, which, quote, leverages the ability of LLMs to reason in natural language and follow instructions in order to decide what to attend to. The name System 2 is derived from the work of Daniel Kahneman, who, in his 2011 book Thinking Fast and Slow, differentiated between System 1 thinking as intuitive and near instantaneous, and System 2 thinking as effortful and slower. The Meta paper also references our friend Stephen Sloman, who in 1996 made the case for two systems of reasoning, associative and deliberative or rule-based. Given our interest in the idea of LLMs being able to help people make better decisions, which often requires more deliberative thinking, we asked Steve to come back on the podcast to get his reaction to this research and generative AI in general. Yet again, we had a dynamic conversation about human cognition and modern AI, which field is learning what from the other, and a few speculations about the future. We're grateful for Steve taking the time to talk with us again and hope that he'll join us for a third time when his next book is released sometime in 2024. Stephen Sloman is a professor of cognitive, linguistic, and psychological sciences at Brown University, where he has taught since 1992. He studies how people think, including how we think as a community, a topic he wrote a fantastic book about with Philip Fernbach called The Knowledge Illusion: Why We Never Think Alone. For more about that work, please check out our first interview with Steve from June of 2021. Before we get to the interview, I'd like to share some exciting news from Artificiality. After 4 years, we have relaunched Artificiality with a new site, new focus, and new business model. Please check out our new site at www.artificiality.world and learn about how we're organizing our work around an emerging collection of obsessions that follow and forecast the major shifts at the intersection of humans and machines. We encourage you to sign up for our weekend briefing newsletter, which, along with this podcast, will remain free. You can also learn about our subscriber and Artificiality Pro tiers, which provide access to our artificial philosophy essays, meta research, community events, subscriber-only podcasts, and much more. Thanks for being with us. We hope you'll join us for the next phase of our journey making sense of AI.
Fascinated by this crossover between humans and machines. So whenever I look at these AI papers that just come thick and fast and are hard to keep up with, I'm always on the lookout for these ones, particularly that take things from neuroscience or cognitive science and apply them to AI and back the other way. And that's a really fruitful ground for thought-provoking ideas. And when I came across this one from Meta that had your name in it, it really piqued my attention because we've spent time talking before on dual system thinking. And also there has been people talk a lot about busting the illusion of explanatory depth using these large language models, sort of a private and soft way of doing it. So your name's actually come up quite a few times. And but this paper was the one that really made me want to reach out because it was such a direct reference to your paper in 96, The Empirical Case for Two Systems of Reasoning. So I was fascinated. I'm fascinated to hear what you think of kind of this overall process of going backwards and forwards between machine intelligence and human intelligence, particularly with this paper from Meta.
Well, I would be really interested to talk to the authors about whether they, in fact, were motivated by my paper or by the ideas in general, or whether they came to them independently and then discovered that cognitive scientists had been talking about them. I mean, like if you look at the role of neuroscience in the development of neural nets, it was actually pretty minimal, right? Like it was basically, cognitive scientists appreciating that the brain consists of a whole lot of fairly stupid processors that are connected together, suggesting that there's some emergence of intelligence from all of this interaction. And and neural nets were born, and they very slowly turned into large language models. But I don't think that you had to study neuroscience to do any of that, right? Like, we all know that the brain consists of billions of relatively stupid processors, although there are actually people who argue that single neurons are incredibly sophisticated, that they have the power of Turing machines. But that's another issue. So I'm actually, I wish I could say that cognitive science has been central to the development of AI. I'm not entirely convinced that that's true. So my daughter, not the one we were talking about, a daughter I have in Princeton. This is one who's now at the University of Manchester doing computer science. And we were talking one day about system 1 versus system 2 reasoning, intuition and deliberation, and how that could be realized in large language models. And she had, turns out that because she's thinking about machine learning, she had thought about this stuff in quite some detail and had some ideas about taking two nets and putting them either in an adversarial or cooperative position relative to one another, and having one verify the output of the other. And all of this sort of sprang from the mind of a computer scientist, right? It didn't come out of insights from cognitive science. So, yeah, I'm not entirely convinced that we've contributed that much to this.
It seems a lot. I mean, a lot of, when you read the history of some of these discoveries, back and forth, whether it's reinforcement learning and dopamine sort of going one direction or neural nets going the other, it's all very analogical, metaphorical. It's sort of like an inspiration that might spark an idea, but it's really very, very much at that level. It's not, well, here's the math that would do that.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. And, what the direction of insight is remains an open question. I mean, you're right that there are a lot of parallels between what's going on in AI and what's going on in cognitive science. There's no question about that. And that's a fascinating fact. So I actually think that the development of these large language models is by far the biggest source of insight into cognitive process that we've seen in decades, right? So the analogy is certainly meaningful and fruitful, but what the direction of causality is, what the direction of insight is, I'm not sure. I'm not sure it really matters. Right?
No, keep going on what you were saying before about what you just said about the biggest insight into language. Does it
into cognition?
Into cognition, sorry, from the language models. That's keep going on that. That's interesting.
Well, look, I mean, cognitive scientists have been trying to understand how people think for, a long time, since at least the mid-50s, if not centuries before. And now suddenly we have these things that have so many human-like properties and seem to operate in ways that parallel how humans operate in critical ways, right? So, like, the key human-like properties in my mind are their incredible ability to do tasks that you don't expect them to be able to do, right? Like, they're constantly surprising people in what they can do. Second, their tendency to make really ridiculous errors, right? That's another similarity to human beings. And at a deeper level, the fact that they depend so much on memory, right? The fact that they depend so much on these pattern completion operations. And there's been evidence for decades that this is how people reason, think, solve problems, never mind how they remember, right? Or how we remember. So it just feels like we're operating based on exactly the same kind of processes that these machines are operating on. I mean, I guess I'm sort of prone to believe that because when I was in grad school, one of my mentors was Dave Rumelhart, who is one of the founders of the neural net movement, right? He was critical in developing the backpropagation algorithm, which really took neural nets off got them off the ground. And so, he opened my eyes to the analogy between human cognition and what we then called connectionist networks. And the latest ones are very, very similar. They have a few additional bells and whistles, but the biggest difference is just that they're bigger, right? Like massively bigger and have massively more information. I mean, I think it's also critical that they're trained to predict, right? Like that. And there's been evidence for a long time that that's how the brain learns too, that it's a predictive mechanism, right? I'm sure there's all sorts of evidence that dopamine encodes reward prediction error. So there are all of these analogies between these large language models and human cognition, and the fact that they're as capable as they are, and that they make mistakes the way people do, sort of gives me a metaphor to use when I'm trying to understand how people are doing something. And the availability of that metaphor is essentially the big insight that cognitive science can now take advantage of.
What's been the most recent surprise for you about how these language models have performed?
Well, the most recent one were the papers you pointed me to. So I'm actually, because I just looked one up 5 minutes ago. I didn't know about the work on the illusion of explanatory depth. I guess Malik is the name. So I looked it up, and there it is. I didn't really have time to explore it in detail, and that's surprising. But the one that really surprised me, I saw a couple of months ago, and that was large language models' ability to do causal and counterfactual reasoning in very reasonable ways, in ways that seem to be to approach the power of humans to do that kind of reasoning, right? Now, look, all of these demonstrations suffer from the fact that large language models encode such a large percentage of the internet that you don't know if they're just spitting out stuff they've seen before or if they're really reasoning anew about things. I mean, in some sense, that doesn't bother me because I think that's mostly how people reason, right? But in the case of causal reasoning and counterfactual reasoning, it's clear that we can reason about stuff that we've never encountered before. And so it's not 100% clear yet that large language models can. But nevertheless, they were given this sort of standard battery of causal reasoning tests, and they achieved 94% performance or something ridiculous. And that's amazing. And the reason I think it's amazing is so we got into this conversation because Helen told me about this paper that was appealing to, what people like to call system 2 reasoning, what I like to call deliberative reasoning, right? So cognitive scientists have been talking for a long time. The paper Helen referenced from 1996 that I wrote is about this claim that there are 2 ways people reason. One is essentially by memory, one I've always thought about in terms of neural net reasoning. That's intuitive reasoning, right? Where we get some prompt, some stimulus, and we complete a pattern. And then the other, deliberative reasoning, is more analytical, right? So we focus on certain aspects of the thing we're reasoning about. We relate it to other aspects, often by formal rules of inference, using perhaps formal systems that our culture has taught us, right? And that allows us to derive conclusions in a non-memory based way, in a different kind of more sort of traditional symbolic reasoning way. And causal reasoning, and certainly counterfactual reasoning, has seemed to most people like sort of paradigmatic instances of this second kind of deliberative reasoning. So the fact that machines can now do it without having those deliberative skills is kind of shocking. Right?
Yeah, so it's because I think of this as being. I mean, I have the mental model from Judea-Pearl, where at the bottom we've got the correlations, and that's machines and humans do that, and then up to causal, and then up to counterfactual, and up that ladder, the machines come at human peril. And there's the same thing with creativity as well, you know, from exploratory to combinatorial to transformational creativity, and up that ladder machines come at our peril. But I've come to wonder in the last few weeks we've got to conceptualize intelligence differently. And there's everything from terrible benchmarks that don't really work very well on machines, and maybe not on humans as well, but the whole benchmarks might be wrong, to how we conceptualize what it is that we do, because you can feel the existential angst coming from people. You know, the machines catching up through the power of language. One, it tells us so much about the power of language to encode all of these things about the world, whether it's spatial reasoning and counterfactual or causal reasoning. But the other is, well, how do we think about matching ourselves with these things now?
Yeah. Well, there have been movements in cognitive science going back at least 50 years that suggest that people are less like, you know, logical machines than you're suggesting, right? Than the sort of standard model of human beings suggests. I mean, from way back to Newell and Simon's stuff on problem solving, right? They themselves appealed to memory processes. I mean, there are famous papers that Herb Simon was involved in, showing that chess masters, you know, don't look any farther forward than, you know, chess intermediate players. That really it's a matter of pattern recognition. And that's exactly the kind of reasoning that these neural nets are capable of. And then there's work in reasoning, you know, so Peter Wason is an old British psychologist who showed that people suffer from confirmation biases and are incapable of certain basic logical of reasoning using certain basic logical schema like modus tollens. Then there's the Kahneman and Tversky, you know, revolution in understanding decision-making that showed that people's judgments and decision-making are based more on these sort of simple heuristics than they are on any sophisticated reasoning process. There certainly has been pushback to all these claims. Like there's been a Bayesian movement in cognitive science for years. But to be honest, I don't feel like it's really gotten us any, you know, very far. So there have been psychologists, and I would even say the majority of psychologists, the sort of standard story in cognitive science is that people don't reason according to the kind of metaphor that comes out of the computer revolution, right? Like we're not Turing machines. That's not the way to think about us, but rather we're bags of tricks, right? We're bundles of heuristics that rely a lot on memory, that rely a lot on similarity-based processing, that approximate and take guesses, that we make errors and confabulate all the time. These are all properties of these large language models. So in some sense, I'm not surprised in the way that you're describing, right? What the benchmarks for reasoning are is a separate question, I think. Like, is that question seems to be more about what is the best way to evaluate whether a system is doing things right or wrong? And so I'm not sure that particular question is as much a cognitive science question as a question about, how to evaluate performance generally. But in terms of how machines relate to people, the machines seem to be getting closer and closer. They just have so much more knowledge.
Hi, it's Dave with just a brief interruption. If you're enjoying our podcast, we'd love it if you'd share it with someone who you think might enjoy it too. And check out everything that Artificiality has to offer at artificiality.world. Reach out anytime. We'd love to hear from you. Back to the interview. I want to flip the direction around a little bit. And yesterday in a workshop, someone asked us a great question, which was, are any of these products, any of these systems designed to help us slow down? And I thought it was such a brilliant question, right? Because we're working through this, like how to make decisions with generative AI. That's the topic of the workshop. And you're working through and going through all these use cases and experimenting with how to use these tools to both, somehow to go find the answer, but also to help you think about your own thinking and be more metacognitive to actually, to solve a problem in a different way, to break things down. But it was such a wonderful question because you have this first reaction of, oh my God, these things are really fast. Because you ask a question and suddenly it's, mine the data cosmos for some sort of, incredible, answer.
Rare fact you've never heard of.
Rare fact you've never heard of.
Well, I shouldn't say fact.
But then his question was, he didn't use the word deliberative, but it's exactly what he was asking was, has anyone using these tools to help you slow down and be more deliberative in how you receive what you're getting from these tools? And that got me thinking about, like, what would it mean for a system to be able to understand when it might be more productive for you to be more deliberative. I've asked you this kind of, the users asked this kind of question. Is there any way that a system could be smart enough to say, here's the answer, but hold on, here's how you got to stop, slow down a little bit. Here's a deliberative process to go through to really think through this. Like, would there ever be a way for these things to be intelligent enough to know when it might be better to be deliberative?
So, until Helen pointed me to this work on System 2 reasoning, I had felt that the weakness of the latest revolution in AI has been the failure to make progress on issues of deliberation, right? Like, these systems really do operate through memory. I mean, it's a very sophisticated memory. It's considering correlations between elements at multiple levels of abstraction. It's quite incredible how sophisticated it is. But it's still memory in a way. And it's lacked any kind of, logical, causal, mathematical reasoning ability, any serious reasoning ability beyond the appeal to memory. And so it's hard for me to imagine a system that helps you deliberate without being able, let me restate that. It's hard for me to imagine a system that tells you how to deliberate, that offers a recipe for deliberation, if it can't deliberate itself.
Sure.
On the other hand, it seems like if you have a system that's doing all this intuitive work for you, it kind of gives you more room to engage in deliberation yourself. Right? So you're not going to be distracted by going down the wrong path as much, one might hope, if it's delivering a reasonable answer. And and you're just not going to sort of feel the need to construct and reconstruct memory cues to help you retrieve things. You'll rather have that much more mental space to focus on like verification or, serious logic or math or something like that. Whether people will do that, I have no idea.
No, neither do I. But I have. It does.
People are unpredictable.
Oh, aren't they just? There's something that we've consistently noticed, though, in our decisions with generative AI workshops that we've run quite a few of them now. And here's something we've consistently noticed. Before we ran workshops on just how to make decisions with data, the biggest problem that we had was that people would instantly go down rabbit holes with data, jump to conclusions about solutions, and run off to the races. And one of the nudges in our book came from a good friend who's a coach, and it was like wallow in the problem. And we had delay intuition from Kahneman. Where it's like we had to put so much effort into keeping people in the problem. Now it's actually hard to get them out of the problem. They start using ChatGPT or Claude or, Bing or whatever, and they seem to just naturally stay in the problem. And they become more deliberative from lots of different directions. I hadn't thought about it as deliberation, but it's essentially what it was. But it's changed the entire fabric of the workshops. The whole vibe changes in terms of problem solving and decision making, where it's for the first time, it's not don't jump to a conclusion. It's like okay, let's keep going. It's quite a strange shift in dynamic that we've been talking about, but haven't been able to put it into that kind of frame that you just alerted us to.
Yeah, and part of that could be that people are learning how to use this new form of intelligence and having that experience, and so that's interesting and engaging and pulls you in to be sort of
novel.
Immersive.
Yeah.
But I think there's also something about the conversational nature of interaction. So in the past, it's, well, here's the data that came from your, some sort of data, portal, and it's there. And then I have to convert that into a slide because everybody communicates in PowerPoint. And you're just your focus is on the output and what you're creating. Whereas now this interaction with these tools is conversational, and you say something and it responds. And then it sometimes has a little thing at the end to sort of, well, this is some other things you might do, and obviously in our structure, we're focusing on getting people to have this iterative, keep going, keep taking. If that isn't really right, keep going. And then they find that it's like it sparks some, curiosity in something that they would have just kind of moved past.
Yeah, that's almost an aha moment.
Yeah.
The aha being, I can keep talking to this thing. The first answer isn't necessarily the answer. There's more to do here. And the challenge now is to actually get people to talk to each other, not just the chatbot. It's pulling them back out of that process is really quite tricky.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So this is something I don't have any direct experience with. Do you think that interacting with the chatbot is fundamentally different in that regard than interacting with another human being? Like, does interacting with another human being keep you as engaged in the particular topic as you're suggesting that interacting with the chatbot does?
I think it could. I think it takes a particularly focused person that you're talking to, right? Like if you have, a directed conversation and you're scheduled to have this particular conversation, if you're talking to a coach or somebody who's actually like their job is to be focused on what you want to talk about. But I think there's something interesting, which is that these chatbots, their job is to be talking to you. They don't get distracted. They don't go off on some other tangent, right? And their pure focus is about being responsive to you. And that's pretty engaging. That's attractive. There's something that's, paying attention. The other thing I think we've seen is there really is nothing. There's no way that there's a dumb question or a dumb prompt. You don't have that like, well, I'm not sure I really want to like offer up that I don't really know what I'm talking about, or I'm not really sure, because the chat between the two of you is essentially private. I mean, yes, we've got all the security concerns of the tools, but in reality, it's not like somebody's reading and going, you idiot, And there's always that risk with another person that somehow that other person is going to feel differently about you because you asked a naive question or just a novice question. I don't really know much, so can I ask you? And that'll never happen with a chatbot. You can ask it a completely beginner question, and that's where, in some ways, that's where the tools shine, is when you don't know much, right? That's one of the best use cases. I don't really know much about this, so I'm going to ask it. So there's something about that I think keeps
the more questions you ask, the more that just pop into my mind. I think there's a couple of differences that I've particularly noticed that seem to repeat themselves. One is that you don't, and some of this is my personal reflection, but you don't sit there thinking of your answer when the chatbot's talking to you. Like you do with a person, right? You sit there and the person's talking and you're thinking, what am I going to say next? Whereas you don't do that with a large language model. You're actually reading the output as it comes. The one I notice in the groups is that, and people have said it to us, is there's no distraction to gossip. When you're talking to a person, something in the physical world happens, or something, you get some sort of distraction that's completely orthogonal to completely unrelated to what you're talking about, and suddenly you're talking about the latest office and political gossip, who's done what to whom. So the just the focus and the attention and the ability to stay in the topic, but at the same time, there's this sense of freedom that you can wander into related parts of a topic. And partly because if you're asking questions that do that weaving and that combination from memory that these large language models are just so good at, you get really curious about the next thing. So the types of rabbit holes you go down with the machine because of its memory are just really different to the types of rabbit holes that you go down when you're having a conversation between the two. So between the two of us, if we're talking about what's happened today in AI, we have this noisy bouncing around. Well, I just saw this sort of conversation, and what do you think about what might have happened at OpenAI? That sort of stuff. Whereas when I'm having a conversation with ChatGPT on this, just the rabbit holes are different. My attention is just it feels like it's in a materially different place. And maybe that's something to do with the affordance of the screen and the chat and the prompt window. His prompt window is much bigger than ChatGPT's, thinking about like what it is that you're guided to pay attention to. Sort of makes me wonder.
Yeah. Yeah, no, this stuff is so fascinating. I wonder if it also has to do with the fact that when you're interacting with a human being, you have multiple goals, right? Like you not only want to learn about the topic, but you want to be liked and you want to entertain the other person. You want to share stories to help them build an image of you. And maybe your interaction with a chatbot is simpler in the sense that you're just focused on the topic and you're not trying to impress it in the same way. I mean, what's clear is that most people do not enjoy really complex topics, right? Like the way to lose people's interest at a cocktail party is to start explaining things, is to engage in too much deliberation, right? People want to hear stories. They want to hear jokes. They want to be light. And I guess there's less pressure in that direction with the chatbot.
That's so right.
I really just one last comment. Dave's point that you're able to ask stupid questions strikes me as really important, right? So I wrote this book, The Knowledge Illusion, with Phil Fernbach, and after we wrote it, Phil wrote a blog post about the importance of asking stupid questions. And, as a teacher, I'm constantly encouraging the class to ask stupid questions. And nobody wants to do it, right? Because everybody wants to come across as the smartest person in the room. And you ask a stupid question, you're revealing your ignorance. It's just, it turns out that 75% of the class benefits from you asking a stupid question. So the freedom to do that feels like really, really important.
That does, because you're right, it is hard. It's so hard to step up and do that. As it's somewhat of a tangent, but maybe it's helpful sometime when you're trying to encourage your class. One of the sort of the words that I can never forget from Steve Jobs is he would start things off by saying, well, this might be a dopey idea. And what a great way. First of all, dopey is less painful than stupid, right? But also as a leader to just start off with, well, this might be a dopey idea. And just accepting the fact that most ideas are dopey. Every once in a while, there's one that isn't. And what's nice is that it starts with, well, this is probably dopey. That's the default. Now we can filter that down and try and find maybe some good ones. But I think that it's interesting to think about. So you can say it makes it easier to make a stupid question, ask a stupid question. You don't have this sort of urge or burden, depending on how you think about it, to be liked. To share stories that help you empathize, all of that sort of that cognitive work that we do that is so important about building human relationships, but you're not doing that with the tool. You're also not worried at all about fatiguing the tool, right? I can get back a list of, well, can you give me 5 ideas? And if I asked you that and you gave me 5 ideas, I might ask you to dig down one. And then I'd be like, I'm going to be kind of a bother if I ask you about every single one of them. And I ask you 3 times to go deeper on each of them. And now I've asked you 15 questions. I think you might be like, all right, Dave, it's time, Whereas the tool, like you can keep going for days and dig deeper and deeper.
Well, I don't know. We just saw this morning that ChatGPT doesn't like to do that forever.
Forever. It will stop, but a lot longer, right?
Yeah.
And so you can go so much deeper, which taps into that sort of deliberative part. At least for me, when I'm really trying to deliberate something and I see 5 items in a list or something, if I'm being truly deliberative, I want to dig into each of them until I feel that I've satisfied my curiosity, that I actually understand each of those. That seems to be much easier in a chatbot than it is with a person, just because I'm worried of kind of pissing you off by taking too much time.
Yeah, but of course there's more. I mean, that's a great point, but there's more to it than worried about pissing you off. It's also the fact, like if you ask me a question, I'll answer it to the extent I can. And if you push me harder, like I'm already tapped out. if I could go deeper, I would have the first time. Whereas ChatGPT or any of these chatbots, they can go deeper because they can start searching different aspects of their knowledge base. So to some extent, that I think that's a function of just knowing so much.
Yeah, and there's a feature aspect to it, and at least some of these tools are they don't answer everything, obviously, that they know. Part of that is it's just way too much, and part of it is it'll cost too much. Because the longer the response, the more compute it takes. But I do really like that part of the iterative, that I got part of the answer and then I'm choosing the next step question. Sometimes it's, can you just explain that a little bit more? Or it's, well, but what if you did that and thought about it from this angle? Like I'm part of that journey of getting to a point of exhaustion. And you're right, though, it is my exhaustion of learning rather than its exhaustion of knowledge. At least sometimes.
Yeah. But sometimes, when you're with a human, it's sort of the exhaustion and the ignorance display happens on both sides, right? Sure. So you ask a stupid question, you're worried about looking stupid, but then the person answering eventually has to look stupid. You want to stop before you have to say, you know what, I don't know anymore. Like you've got the end of me, and we do that when people ask this question. I say, "Oh, you've actually exceeded my knowledge."
All right, well,
but it's not a cool thing to say. I don't like saying.
I'm going to grab this one because I think in the first podcast we had with you, we asked you to speculate on what the impact of the knowledge illusion would be, right? And sort of thinking about what's the impact of the knowledge illusion from being able to search the world through Google. And I think we hit where you got to point of being like, that's all I know, stop asking. But so I'm going to risk that again. I'm going to, and it was fair, which was, look, this is what we did our research on. And what you're asking is a speculative question, which you hadn't done research on, which is totally fair. I don't mean to be negative at all. See, here I am trying to be
in that
empathetic.
case, it probably wasn't mine.
Yes.
It was probably Adrian Ward's research.
But I'm going to add to risk it again because we still, every time we talk about decisions, we talk about the knowledge illusion, and we ask people to explain how a toilet works. And by the way, every time we do it, it confirms, aligns with your research every single time. But we've thought about it a lot that now these chatbots have even potentially a broader amount of information than you can access, or at least it's easier to access the kind of information it is than the multiple click steps you have to go through Google. Go to Google, then find an article, And I continue to wonder about what form of knowledge illusion we will experience as we become used to having these extraordinary large language models in our pocket that we can ask a question at any time. And I know that's a speculative one because we also know that these things have, like, it's all over the place, that they have error rates. But I sort of wonder what that means for people. And as organizations are thinking about embedding these inside their tool set, what kind of knowledge illusion could all these people be experiencing? Because, well, I've got basically every digitized recording of human history in my phone.
Yeah. Well, before I speculate on that, let me ask you something. Do you think it's possible that part of the focus that people achieve with chatbots has to do with the fact that they don't trust the answers? Mm-hmm. That they're just not certain about what they're getting back, and so they want to verify it. So they kind of look for coherence between what it's saying and other things it says as a means of verifying what it's saying? Is that part of it?
I would. Well, I'll caveat my answer by saying we have a biased set of anecdotes in terms of observation. And I say that because we start off working with people talking about the errors and thinking and talking about how generation of any form of content, but most of the time we're now working in text, but generation of text is really cheap and easy and fast. And what's valuable is the human judgment on what comes out of the tool. So we're prefacing our group to be thinking as skeptically and with judgment, right? And applying their judgment. So
almost to the point of trying to catch it out.
Yeah, so our experience will definitely be quite biased in terms of watching how people use the tool. I think what you're saying, though, is what we observe, which is they get the answer back and they go, okay, let me ask a little bit more about that. Or let me think is that, because we start off with thinking about how can you use these tools when accuracy doesn't matter, because you can't always rely on the accuracy. So what are ways to use these tools where that's not a problem, which then primes people to think, this may not be accurate. Is that okay? So
and we also start
setting them up to be deliberative, I guess.
Yeah. And we also start with the approach is the things that the language model is particularly good at, like writing lists of standard practice ways of doing things, or best practice ways, or writing creative ideation of different things and combinations. So people are primed to be discriminatory, to have a list of 10 things and say, 3 of those are awesome, 2 of those are and the rest I don't care about. So they're looking in that discriminatory kind of way, like, what can I get rid of? What do I want to take? It's almost like a sorting process that they're taking on. So I think that influences it. When people go deeper and they're more in a creation mode, they're looking for, like, they're creating code or they're creating images and it's less discriminatory. It's more, that's what I want. It's more sort of, they almost become a little bit more subservient to the machine. And then I think that actually goes away. And I think there's almost a mode of thinking that shifts as you engage longer and go into a more complex use case. But certainly in the starting out phase, it's just a straight sort of looking about what to remove as opposed to what to take, you know what I mean? But that's a good question. I'm going to think more about that.
Mm.
Well, I mean, so the reason I asked it was, in an effort to say something intelligent about Dave's question, about what's going to happen to the illusion of explanatory depth when we all have little chatbots sitting in our pockets. And, so on one hand, we'll have fewer human relationships, right? Because we'll have these strong relationships with our chatbot. So that might reduce the illusion, right? So my belief is that a really significant part of the illusion comes from the fact that we depend on others for our knowledge, right? So we think we understand how toilets work, even though we don't, because there are other people who do understand how toilets work, and we have access to those people. We have access to the knowledge. So the knowledge is residing in our community rather than in our heads. So on that view, if the knowledge is residing in a chatbot that we have access to, then yeah, that's going to pump up the illusion big time, right? And in a sense, it should, right? Because we do have that knowledge. We do have access to that knowledge. What's going to be critical is the degree to which we trust it, right? So if you believe in a community of knowledge, then relations of knowledge become relations of trust, right? We know whatever it is that the people we trust know. So will we trust these chatbots? Do people now trust the chatbots? I think the answer to the question really depends on what you think about trust,
What happens when we have the illusion of knowledge, but that knowledge is an illusion itself?
Oh, meta illusions.
Well, at times, I mean, you think of the knowledge in the system as being an illusion. I mean, there is, because of its predictive nature and because of the it be acting as a guessing machine and having hallucinations, like, is it truly knowledge or is it the illusion of knowledge? I don't know. Yeah. I'm asked. That could be a dopey question. That could be a dopey idea.
I'm sitting there trying to figure out what you're talking about.
What is knowledge anyway? Right? Is there actual knowledge? What does it mean to know someone? Yeah. I suspect there's not a solid answer to that question.
Well, say let's keep going on this illusion of explanatory depth. I have been wondering, as we've been playing with these image tools in particular, and the fact that you can just make anything, and it looks real. Dave generated these awesome images of Biden and AOC and Taylor Swift protesting outside of Starbucks, and they're so real, they're so uncanny, and you run people through this as well, and there's some text examples and what have you, but you run people through this and people suddenly have this, oh wow, what is real, and what happens to the illusion when nothing might be real, like all these images out of the Middle East. I assume the ones on the New York Times are real. I assume the ones on TikTok are maybe less real. I don't know. But this illusion for me has started to really break down with all of the fakes and the knowledge that the fakes are there no matter what we try and do. So I've almost become... in the last year, I've gone from sort of seeing as believing to I literally don't believe anything, and then it has to be proven to me.
Yeah. So, look, I agree with you, and I've been going through a similar experience, right? Like anytime I hear a political pundit talk, I might come out feeling like, oh, okay, now I understand the issue, or I at least understand a perspective on the issue. But then someone else will say something and I'll realize that what they said was BS or based on faulty data or something. And like there's so many holes in so much information we receive, right? Like never mind deep fakes, even when people are telling us stuff directly in reputable publications or reputable newscasts, it turns out it's just such a superficial gloss on the story that there's no real understanding. And you discover this when you actually know something about the topic, and then you hear it presented on the news, and suddenly you realize, what either a limited or even false perspective it is. And yes, it takes away from one's sense of understanding, absolutely. But it's important to appreciate, I think, how limited the domain that operates in. Like that's not going to affect your sense of understanding of toilets or toasters or your husband, right? Or so much that you experience in everyday life. It's really about this very particular set of domains that we learn about through broadcast. It's actually a small component of most people's lives.
I find that you're in I love thinking back to your book because it has, book's called The Knowledge Illusion. And I feel like we spend so much time now debating what is knowledge and what is an illusion. Right? If we sit here and say what is real, you flip that around and say, well, if it's not real, it's an illusion. Well, what is an illusion really? Is it truly an illusion, or is that real now? And so there's two words I keep feeling like we're bantering them around, and it actually matters so much because of what because of the sort of the core thesis and understanding that we know what we know from a community, and we think we know more we do because of the community. But now we're asking this whole world of AIs, at least for us, asking these fundamental questions of what does it mean to know something, and what is the reality of knowing anything, and what is the reality of anything. And I realize that's just sort of like maybe a little too philosophical for this time of the morning, but it does just sort of, I keep feeling like every time we bring up, your work, it falls into this like really fundamental question of the change that AI is causing in the world.
Yeah, that's interesting. So what does it mean to know something? I mean, look, I'm a pragmatist, right? So what it means to know something is to answer questions correctly in the sense that there are questions whose answers refer to something measurable in the world, and thus they can be determined right or wrong, right? So if I'm making a prediction about, whether or not, you're going to publish this podcast, I'm going to be right or I'm going to be wrong. If I'm making a prediction about whether if I move my right leg forward, I'm going to fall down the stairs, I'm going to be right or I'm going to be wrong. So when the claims one is making, when one's representations are grounded in the world, right, then I think knowledge becomes a rather concrete thing because it's measurable. I mean, and that's sort of what defines science, right? Science is something constitutes science, in my opinion, when it involves claims that can be true or false, and there's a way to determine whether they're true or false. So there's a lot of stuff that we can't, that isn't grounded in that sense, like what's morally right, what's morally wrong. I don't know how to measure the answer to that question. Who's going to be the best person to be president, right? It's not so clear even that can be well grounded, in that there's so many different ways of measuring that, and you might care about different things than somebody else. So I agree that the notion of knowledge is often ill-defined. But nevertheless, if we're talking about like a chatbot, right, there are certain things we can measure that will allow us to determine, at least in those domains, whether it's knowledgeable or not.
So just because we don't know everything doesn't mean we don't know we don't know nothing. Did I say that right? I sounded upside down. Paul Bloom wrote a great article in the New Yorker, I think yesterday or the day before, about using AI for moral reasoning. And he sort of flips the script and says, well, maybe AI is actually better than us. And he did it in a nice way. He didn't do it in sort of a technocratic kind of way like a venture capitalist would. It's more a question about the difference between sort of aligning AI with human values as opposed to maybe saying that we can take out the best of human values and code those and use them to help situations where the human values aren't operating as well as they should be, for example, or being able to expose the differences between them. He's a good writer. It's a worthwhile read.
I'm going to take this opportunity to plug my next book.
Awesome.
Which is about sacred values versus consequentialism, right? So there are different strategies for making decisions. One is kind of the way we normally think about decision making, to optimize consequences, right? To get the best results, to get the highest utility from our decision. But the fact is that in many domains, what people often do are apply sacred values, right? And they don't even think about consequences. They just say, I have the right to own a gun, right? Whatever the consequences don't even matter. It's just my right, right? Or I have the right to have an abortion, right? And so if somebody is going to appeal to values, I want to know what kind of values they're talking about. I want to know if they're talking about values that apply to actions, what's right and what's wrong. Are those the things we should be teaching AIs? Or are we talking about values that are applied to outcomes, right? Are we talking about values that sort of maximize interests? And then we have to be clear about whose interests we're trying to maximize.
And in the world of AI, it strikes me that OpenAI's goal is to create general intelligence that can, I think what it basically, I'll paraphrase, but it can exceed any human in economically valuable tasks. So their goal is to create their measurement of value of the AI, at least in terms of their mission, is economic value.
Right. So that sounds like a consequentialist notion of value.
Yeah.
Right. Which may be fine, but like take something like freedom of speech. So I believe we all have the right to free speech, or we should all have the right to free speech. We could obviously talk for a long time about exactly what that means, but nevertheless, I'm going to arrive at the end of that conversation with the notion that there is some kind of speech that should be protected. And that actually has nothing to do with consequences, right? So even people who want to achieve something that's the opposite of what I want to achieve, they also should have that right. So I think focusing on economic considerations can actually be highly problematic.
When is your book coming
Yeah.
out? Is this something that has a schedule yet?
No, I've actually just finished the first draft. I'm on the verge of sending the first draft to the publisher. So I have no idea what the publisher has in mind. I'm hoping, sort of middle of next year.
That'd be awesome. I ordered a book yesterday on Amazon, pre-ordered, that's due for release at the end of August 2024. So I thought that was kind of slightly irrational. And
you don't have to pre-order my book. I'll send
that'd
you
be awesome. I can't wait, honestly.
Yeah. But just remember, when someone sends you a free copy, you have to read it.
I read everything. I read pretty much.
Oh, good for
if I haven't got through the first chapter, I won't read it. But I only buy books I'm going to read. I only accept books I'm going to read, and I read them cover to cover, to the point that in every single book I read, I find a typo in every single book.
Sometimes our interviews, like this one, trail off while the conversation continues. Thanks again to Steve for joining us. We're looking forward to the next conversation.
Solid state.